They refused to serve him in front of a crowd of shoppers, all because of the red MAGA hat he wore with quiet pride. The cashier mocked him, the manager turned a blind eye, and bystanders pulled out their phones to record the spectacle. Little did they know, this ordinary man was the financial backbone of the very company they worked for. What happened when he came back? It shocked everyone. Mr. Jackson, a seasoned businessman with a quiet confidence and a knack for staying composed under pressure, was calmly pushing his shopping cart down the aisles of a bustling supermarket. His red MAGA hat sat snugly on his head, a hat he wore out of principle, not provocation. For him, it was a symbol of his beliefs, not a statement meant to spark conflict. As he made his way through the store, he noticed a few lingering glances. Some people looked at him with mild curiosity, others with visible disdain. He had grown used to these reactions. After all, wearing anything politically charged in today's world was bound to turn heads. But Jackson wasn't the type to get rattled by strangers' opinions. His years of experience in business had taught him the value of keeping a cool head and staying true to his convictions. Reaching the checkout lanes, he approached the register manned by a young cashier named Kaiden. Kaiden was in his early 20s, with a lightning bolt tattoo on his neck and a silver nose ring that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. As Jackson unloaded his groceries onto the conveyor belt, he noticed Kaiden smirking, then letting out a loud, sarcastic laugh. The sound was jarring, cutting through the hum of the store. "Seriously?" Kaiden said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You really think that hat is appropriate here? We don't serve people trying to bring back the 50s. Jackson paused, his hand resting on the box of cereal he was placing on the belt. He straightened up, his calm demeanor intact, and met Kaiden's gaze. "Do you really think that's how you should speak to a customer?" he asked evenly, his tone devoid of anger, but laced with quiet authority. Kaiden leaned forward, clearly emboldened by the audience that had begun to gather around them. "Oh, we've got freedom of speech here, Mr. MAGA," Kaiden shot back with a smirk. "And I'm using it to tell you that we're not serving you unless you take off that hat. Or better yet, just leave." The surrounding customers began to murmur, some chuckling, others whispering disapproval. One particularly bold voice rang out from the small crowd forming near the registers. "That's right! Kick him out!" A few people pulled out their phones, eagerly recording the scene. The faint glow of screens cast a surreal light on the tense exchange. Kaiden, now clearly enjoying his moment in the spotlight, crossed his arms and waited smugly for Jackson's reaction. Jackson felt the weight of the moment. He could feel the heat of judgment radiating from the growing crowd, the quiet contempt from Kaiden, the sense that the room was waiting for him to explode or storm off. But that wasn't his style. He adjusted his hat, his hand moving slowly, deliberately, and gave Kaiden a calm but pointed look. "I'll leave," he said simply, his voice steady. "But I'll be back, and when I am, we'll see who gets kicked out." With that, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving his groceries on the belt and a trail of stunned silence in his wake. The crowd parted as he passed, unsure what to make of his composed exit. Kaiden shrugged, dismissing the moment with a laugh, but a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face as Jackson disappeared through the automatic doors. The storm, Jackson knew, was just beginning. Kaiden, riding high on the adrenaline of his self-perceived victory, became the unofficial hero of his break room. He strutted around the supermarket, recounting his triumph to anyone who would listen. "I put that MAGA guy in his place," he declared to a fellow cashier during their break. "Told him to take his hate parade somewhere else. You should have seen his face when he walked out." His colleague, a young woman named Mia, laughed nervously. "I mean, I get it, but what if he complains? You know how corporate is." Kaiden waved her off. "Corporate won't care. They want people like me to stand up for what's right. That guy's probably just a sad old boomer anyway." Word of the incident spread quickly among the staff, and soon Kaiden found himself basking in his newfound fame. Even the store manager, Miss Roberts, seemed to support him. A stern woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor, she called Kaiden into her office later that day. "I heard what happened," she said, her tone brisk but approving. Honestly, it's about time someone took a stand. People like him need to know their outdated views aren't welcome here. Kaiden grinned, feeling vindicated. Exactly. I mean, we're a progressive store, right? It's not just about selling groceries. It's about values. Miss Roberts nodded. Just keep it professional enough that corporate doesn't get wind of it. But between us, good work. While Kaiden was reveling in his moment, Mr. Jackson was at home, meticulously planning his next steps. Sitting in his home office, he opened his laptop and began drafting an email. He described the incident in detail, attaching photos he had discreetly taken during the confrontation. He made sure to highlight the dismissive attitude of both Kaiden and the management. The subject line read, "Urgent, customer discrimination incident at store name." Satisfied with the email, he sent it directly to the corporate office of the supermarket chain. Then he picked up the phone and dialed his lawyer, a sharp-tongued woman named Angela, with a knack for turning even the smallest injustices into major victories. "This isn't just about me," Jackson told her. "This is about setting a precedent. Nobody should be treated this way because of what they believe." Angela agreed and promised to draft a formal complaint, emphasizing the potential for legal and reputational consequences if the issue wasn't addressed promptly. By the evening, Jackson's video of the incident, recorded by one of the bystanders, had started making waves online. It showed Kaiden's smug remarks, the crowd's reactions, and Jackson's calm but pointed exit. The footage struck a nerve, sparking intense debate in the comments section. Some viewers sided with Jackson, condemning the blatant discrimination. "This is ridiculous. Since when do people get kicked out of stores for wearing a hat? So much for tolerance and inclusivity." Others defended Kaiden, applauding his actions. "Good for him! We don't need MAGA propaganda in public spaces." "The hat is a symbol of hate. Kaiden was just standing up for what's right." Meanwhile, back at the store, panic was setting in. The video reached the corporate office faster than anyone expected. Miss Roberts' phone rang late that night, and she answered with her usual curt tone. "This is Roberts." The voice on the other end was not as forgiving. "Miss Roberts, this is Sandra from corporate. We've seen the video from your store. This situation is unacceptable, and it's creating a PR nightmare. We need this resolved immediately." Miss Roberts froze. Of course. I'll handle it." "You'd better. Expect a visit from the regional manager tomorrow morning. And Miss Roberts, this is not optional." Hanging up, Miss Roberts slumped back in her chair, the weight of corporate pressure now crushing the smug satisfaction she had felt earlier. Kaiden, oblivious to the storm brewing above him, continued to bask in his fleeting glory, unaware that his actions were about to bring consequences far beyond what he had imagined. The next morning, the atmosphere in the store was tense. Employees whispered among themselves, glancing nervously at Kaiden, who seemed oblivious to the storm he had unleashed. Miss Roberts, already frazzled from the call with corporate the night before, paced her office, checking her phone every few minutes for updates. She had no idea what to expect but knew it wasn't going to be good. At precisely 9 a.m., the automatic doors slid open and Mr. Jackson entered the store. This time, he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was Mr. Richardson, the regional manager of the supermarket chain, a tall man in his early 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor. Behind them, two attorneys in tailored suits followed closely, their expressions as sharp as their attire. The sight of the group turned heads immediately. Employees froze mid-task, and customers whispered to each other. Kaiden, who was scanning items for a customer at his register, caught sight of the group out of the corner of his eye. His smirk faltered, and his hands hesitated as he swiped a box of cereal. He quickly averted his gaze, pretending not to notice as Mr. Jackson passed by. Jackson, unbothered, walked calmly through the store, his iconic red MAGA hat still perched firmly on his head. He exuded the same quiet confidence he had displayed during the initial confrontation. But this time, the stakes were different. Today, he wasn't just a customer. He was a man with backup. Reaching the manager's office, Mr. Richardson knocked once before opening the door, not bothering to wait for an invitation. Miss Roberts, sitting behind her desk, looked up and instantly turned pale. She quickly stood, smoothing her blazer, and forcing a tight smile. "Mr. Richardson," she greeted, her voice shaky. "I wasn't expecting you so early." "I figured it was best to address this situation right away," Richardson replied curtly. He motioned for Jackson to take a seat while the attorneys remained standing, their presence looming like a pair of silent judges. Miss Roberts sat back down, fidgeting with a pen in her hand. She glanced nervously at Jackson, whose calm, measured expression gave nothing away. Clearing her throat, she began to speak. "First, let me just say that this whole thing has been blown out of proportion," she said quickly. "Our employees were simply trying to protect themselves from, well, potential provocations. We had no personal issue with Mr. Jackson." Before she could continue, Jackson raised his hand, signaling her to stop. His movements were slow and deliberate, his calm demeanor commanding the room. "Provocation?" he said, his tone even but sharp. "Let me make sure I understand. My hat, a symbol of my beliefs, was considered a threat. That's what you're calling provocation?" Miss Roberts opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, unsure of how to answer. The silence was deafening. "I find it interesting," Jackson continued, leaning forward slightly, "that a store so eager to advertise its commitment to inclusivity and respect would allow its employees to discriminate against a paying customer. How exactly does that align with your values?" Miss Roberts squirmed in her seat, glancing at Mr. Richardson for support, but his stern expression offered none. Instead, he spoke, his voice firm. "Miss Roberts, let me make something very clear. Mr. Jackson isn't just a customer. He is one of our largest donors. Thanks to his contributions, we've been able to fund numerous community programs and initiatives. Do you have any idea how much damage this incident could do to our reputation?" I wasn't aware of that," Miss Roberts stammered. "Well, you should have been," Richardson snapped. "Because right now, you've put this entire store, and potentially our entire brand, at risk." Jackson leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of Richardson's words settle. He didn't need to say much. The tension in the room was doing the work for him. Finally, he spoke again, his tone measured but resolute. "I'm not here to ruin anyone's career," he said, "but I won't stand by and let this kind of behavior go unchecked. It's not just about me. It's about principle. If this store can't uphold basic decency and respect, then maybe my money is better spent elsewhere." The room fell silent again, the gravity of Jackson's words hanging heavy in the air. Miss Roberts glanced at Kaiden's name on the employee roster pinned to her desk, knowing the consequences were inevitable. For the first time, she realized the full weight of what her inaction had caused. "Mr. Jackson," she said finally, her voice quieter now, "I assure you, we'll address this immediately." The tension inside the manager's office was palpable, but the supermarket outside carried on as if nothing unusual was happening. Employees moved about nervously, their eyes darting toward the office door every so often. Yet Kaiden, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, was still at his register, gleefully recounting his supposed triumph to anyone within earshot. "You wouldn't believe it," he said, scanning a box of cereal with exaggerated flair. "This guy in a MAGA hat walks in here, acting like he owns the place. I told him to leave and he actually didn't even put up a fight." The customer he was speaking to gave a polite, awkward laugh. Others in line shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to react. Kaiden didn't notice, or didn't care. He was too busy reveling in his version of the story. "And get this," Kaiden continued, leaning forward as though sharing a juicy secret. "He said he'd come back, like that was supposed to scare me. Good luck with that, buddy." Meanwhile, Miss Roberts was inside the office, desperately trying to save face. Sitting across from Mr. Jackson, Mr. Richardson, and the two lawyers, she looked small and defensive, her hands nervously twisting a pen. "Mr. Jackson," she began for what felt like the 10th time, "I assure you, this was a misunderstanding. Our staff never intended to discriminate against you personally." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "You don't have to intend something to be responsible for it. Your employee's behavior wasn't just rude, It was discriminatory, and your decision to excuse it has only made things worse." Miss Roberts flushed, but said nothing. Jackson turned his attention to Richardson, who sat silently, his expression unreadable. "This isn't just about me," Jackson continued. "This is about the principle of how you treat your customers. If your employees feel entitled to judge people based on a hat or a t-shirt, then you've got a much bigger problem than just one incident." Richardson nodded. "I completely agree, Mr. Jackson. That's why we're here, to ensure this doesn't happen again." Jackson leaned back in his chair, his calm demeanor underscored by a quiet authority. "Good. Then let's talk solutions." Miss Roberts straightened, her posture stiff. "What do you propose?" Jackson didn't hesitate. "First, a public apology from the store, acknowledging what happened and making it clear that you value respect for all customers, regardless of their political beliefs. Second, Kaiden needs to be removed from this location. I'm not saying you should fire him. Everyone deserves a chance to learn, but he can't stay here. This environment has already enabled his behavior, and keeping him here sends the wrong message." Richardson nodded again. "I think that's reasonable." Miss Roberts hesitated, then finally said, "I understand. We'll implement these changes immediately." Jackson's expression didn't soften. "Good, because if I don't see action, I'll have no choice but to pull my funding. That includes the community programs I've been supporting for years. This is your opportunity to prove that your values mean something. Don't waste it." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Jackson's words settling over everyone. Back out on the floor, Kaiden's shift was interrupted when Miss Roberts emerged from the office. Her face was pale, and her lips pressed into a thin line. She walked directly to his register, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. "Kaiden," she said curtly, "I need to see you in the office, now." Kaiden froze, his confidence draining as he registered the serious tone of her voice. Sure, let me just—" "Now," she repeated, cutting him off. Kaiden handed off his register to a co-worker, his hands trembling slightly. As he followed Miss Roberts toward the office, the weight of the stares from his colleagues and the murmurs of nearby customers began to sink in. For the first time, he realized this might not end in his favor. When he stepped inside the office, Kaiden was met with the stern faces of Mr. Richardson, the lawyers, and most intimidating of all, Mr. Jackson. The older man's calm expression didn't betray anger, but there was a quiet intensity in his eyes that made Kaiden feel about 2 inches tall. "Kaiden," Miss Roberts began, standing stiffly behind her desk, "your actions yesterday were unacceptable. You not only violated company policy, but you also jeopardized this store's reputation and our relationship with one of our most important supporters." Kaiden opened his mouth to defend himself, but Richardson cut him off. "This isn't up for debate," Richardson said firmly. "You treated a customer with blatant disrespect because of your personal opinions. That's not just unprofessional, it's unacceptable. And now you're going to face the consequences." Kaiden's face turned bright red. I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to?" Jackson interrupted, his voice calm but cutting. "You judged me without knowing a thing about who I am or what I stand for. And when you decided I wasn't worth serving, you crossed the line." Kaiden looked down at his feet, his earlier bravado completely gone. Miss Roberts delivered the final blow. "Effective immediately, you'll be transferred to another location. You'll also undergo mandatory training on customer service and workplace conduct. Consider this your second chance, Kaiden. Don't waste it." Kaiden nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, ma'am." As Kaiden shuffled out of the office, the gravity of his actions weighing heavily on him, Jackson turned back to Miss Roberts. "I trust this will be the last time I have to deal with something like this," Jackson said, standing to leave. "Because next time, I won't be as forgiving." Miss Roberts nodded stiffly. "Understood, Mr. Jackson." And with that, Jackson walked out, his presence leaving an unshakable impression on everyone in the room. Justice, as promised, had been served. The air inside the manager's office was thick with tension, as Kaiden sat stiffly in a chair, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Across the desk sat Mr. Richardson, his expression stern and unreadable, flanked by Miss Roberts, who looked like she'd aged a decade since the previous day. Kaiden's heart raced as he tried to prepare for whatever was coming, though deep down, he knew the situation was beyond repair. Mr. Richardson began without preamble. "Kaiden, after thorough discussion with Mr. Jackson and our legal team, we've come to a decision regarding your future with this company." Kaiden's stomach dropped, but he tried to maintain his composure. I just want to say I didn't mean to offend anyone," he stammered. "I was just standing up for what I thought was right." Richardson raised a hand to silence him. "This isn't about your intentions, Kaiden. It's about your actions. What you did yesterday not only violated company policy, but also jeopardized our reputation and strained our relationship with a key supporter." Kaiden's eyes darted to Miss Roberts, hoping for a lifeline, but her stony expression offered no reprieve. "We appreciate the work you've done here," Richardson continued, his tone unyielding. "But we believe it's in everyone's best interest for you to transfer to another location. This isn't a punishment. It's an opportunity for a fresh start away from the environment that allowed this incident to happen." Kaiden's jaw tightened. "You're transferring me? But that's not fair. Miss Roberts cut him off sharply, her voice trembling with barely restrained anger. "Fair? You want to talk about fair? Do you have any idea the damage you've caused? I've spent the past 24 hours cleaning up your mess while trying to protect this store from total ruin. And now, you have the nerve to complain about fairness." Kaiden shrank back in his chair, his protest dying in his throat. Richardson sighed, clearly impatient to end the discussion. "This decision is final," Richardson said firmly. "You'll be provided with the details of your new assignment later today. And Kaiden, let this be a lesson. Your personal beliefs are yours to keep, but when you're on the clock, your job is to treat every customer with respect. No exceptions." Kaiden swallowed hard, nodding mutely. "Yes, sir." As Kaiden left the office, his head hung low, he nearly collided with Mr. Jackson, who was standing just outside the door. For a moment, the two locked eyes. Kaiden felt a pang of guilt as he took in the calm, steady gaze of the man he had so arrogantly dismissed just a day ago. Jackson adjusted his red MAGA hat slightly, a small but deliberate motion, and said in a low, measured voice, "People don't judge you by the symbols you wear. They judge you by your actions. Remember that, kid." Kaiden nodded, unable to muster a response. Jackson didn't wait for one. He turned and walked away, leaving Kaiden to grapple with the weight of his words. In the days that followed, the supermarket chain released a public statement addressing the incident. It emphasized the company's commitment to respect and inclusivity for all customers, regardless of their personal beliefs or political affiliations. The statement included a direct apology to Mr. Jackson, acknowledging the failure to uphold those values during his visit. The story didn't end there. A video of Mr. Jackson recounting the incident went viral, amassing millions of views online. In the video, Jackson spoke calmly and eloquently about the importance of treating people with dignity, regardless of differences. His message resonated with viewers across the political spectrum, sparking widespread discussions about respect and tolerance. Inspired by the incident, the company launched a new advertising campaign called Stronger Together. The campaign highlighted stories of diverse customers and employees, reinforcing the idea that differences should be celebrated, not weaponized. It became one of their most successful campaigns to date. As for Kaiden, his transfer landed him at a struggling store on the outskirts of the city, far removed from the high-energy environment he was used to. The customers were fewer, the staff was smaller, and the work felt monotonous. It was a humbling experience, one that forced him to reflect on his behavior and its consequences. Meanwhile, Mr. Jackson continued his philanthropic work, channeling his resources into community programs and initiatives that championed fairness and opportunity. For him, the incident was a reminder of why he fought so hard for his principles. Because everyone deserves the chance to be themselves, free from judgment. Justice had been served, not through retribution, but through accountability, growth, and the belief that people could learn from their mistakes. And for Mr. Jackson, that was the victory that mattered most.